Oh, hello, and welcome to yet another Walkie Talkie. And I'm trying to fit this in between heavy rain and high winds. It's a bit of a lull at the moment. But now you can be guaranteed that I've come out. And, well, actually, it's usually just about the time I hit the record button on the camera that the heavens will open up. I do have umbrella. However, there's a bit of wind going around, and I feel that I may end up doing an impression of Mary Poppins. But we'll see. We'll see. But today we have come armed with a subject, and it actually just came to me this morning while I was perusing X. I follow quite a lot of retro accounts on X because I like old stuff. I like retro stuff. I like talking about retro and memories of a childhood growing up playing computer games. It's important to have these things. It keeps a perspective, and the perspective for me was just seeing that one of them does this comparison between games on the C64 and games on the ZX Spectrum, and it was interesting. It's always interesting to see, because the games did look vastly different for the most part, even though they were the same games. They did look vastly different, and there was often the sort of thought process of what was good and what wasn't. Hey up, would you believe it? They're clearing the crap and the drainage. I didn't even know they could get something like that down here. I'm impressed. We'll look away, let the man do his job. Oh. So yeah, the perspective on that was always wonderful. Sorry, just actually seeing the ground here for the first time in months. That's a novelty. So pop up here. Oh, we'll stealth through this gap. It'll be interesting tomorrow coming down here and seeing what it's like. And that's awesome that they're doing that. Now all they need to do is go to the park and do it there. But I think they had to do something with that, because as you've seen on my videos, it's just been getting worse and it's not draining. And the thing is, this is a public walkway. So this would be treated very much the same as a footpath. You know, it's not a park and it's not private land, it's a walkway, it's a lane, a public lane. So people use it all the time. And it would be getting quite hazardous, I would think, for some people. So they had to do something. They just hope they do. I don't know whether they'll do anything with the park, because it's not like I don't think that would be classified as a footway or a footpath. You don't need to go in the park to get from one point to another. I mean, you can do the long way around here. That's how I get back when I've finished. I go the long way round through the village, because obviously that's when I'm picking up, when I say I'm going to pick up my food for my dinner, which I will be later after I've done this walk. But yeah, got a bit distracted there. So yeah, we're going to chat about playing on other people's computers when you were around at your friend's house and what that was like. Because I imagine it's a lot different than it is today, because games did look and play and feel a lot different. So we'll call it there, and I'll see you in the park. Right, in the park we are. Okay, so when I was growing up, as I said, I started out with a VIC-20 and then progressed onto the Commodore 64. Now, here in the UK, as it starts to rain again, as predicted, because I've hit the record button, so just bear with me. We will try and use the umbrella. Here we go. It'll stop in a minute now. Now that I've opened this up, yeah, this umbrella is not happy. Let's lower it down. There we go. So, the BBC, the hell? Yeah, we had the BBC computer at school. There was one. This was when I was a little kid at primary school. We had one, and I remember this being on a trolley that they would wheel round to each individual classroom. You know, like once a month you'd see this thing. But anyway, and then when I went to grammar school, we had a computer lab that had loads of BBC micros in there. How joyous. Anyway, it was a pretty decent computer, in fairness. It was very good. Anyhow, I'm going off on an 80 tangent already. Let's wheel it back in. Let's throw the line out. Wheel me back in. Son of a bitch, it's stopped raining. Unbelievable. Right. I told you, didn't I? So anyway, those were my first two computers, and yeah, look at the puddle. It's not raining. Stop bloody raining. Right, hold on. Right. Strangely enough, it was easy putting the damn thing down than it was bringing it up. The reason I've taken it down is because of the wind. Like I say, I don't fancy... Mind you, it'd be fairly entertaining, wouldn't it? Oh, hello. Are they going to clear the path? I suspect not. They'd be coming to trim a bush or something like that. There'd be 5 of them, 4 sat in the cab and 1 trimming it. Health and safety. Anyway, so yeah, my friends that lived on the same street as me, they had Spectrum computers, and I said before, my mum and dad actually did go out with the intention of getting me the Spectrum 48K because it was hugely popular at that time in the UK. And at that time, while I was had trucks following me not moving, not jumping out of the way. It's a walkway. Anyway, we're going to go over to that side, to my right, like I normally do. So, as I say, my parents ended up getting me the VIC-20, or because of the fact that it had a better keyboard interface than the 48K. They were put off it because they were told that it was prone to error, which is interesting, because I don't actually, it was prone to malfunctioning. Basically, the guy at the store said it's rubber keyboard and it sits on a membrane. That membrane will harden and crack and it will render the keyboard inoperable. You'll have to have the membrane replaced. I must confess that may be a thing, but I never heard of anyone who had a 48K Spectrum having that issue. I just didn't. And I knew quite a few people back in the day that did. What I do know is that Sinclair did update it. Sinclair did change the 48K, and they released one that had an improved keyboard. It was a bigger machine. Now, I don't know if that was the ZX Spectrum 48K Plus. I don't know, or whether the Plus was the 128K. Whoa, creaky McGeeky. I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because I never had one. And I wasn't really that into it at the time. But I suspect that that was the Plus. Now, this will be interesting. Oh, I'm gone. They came out with that, but anyway, that's what put my parents off. They ended up getting me the VIC-20. Then, of course, my sister had the C64, and I really wanted the C64, so, you know, that was the next step up from the computer that I had, as far as I was concerned, and so I ended up getting one of them. My friends, as I say, they had the Spectrum, so, you know, when you're around at each other's houses, and the weather wasn't great, because we actually played out back then, you know, computers were just another toy. You know, they weren't the hub of the home. It was just regarded as a toy, you know, or a device to do like family stuff on, you know, for the 1 in 1,000 people that actually used it for spreadsheets and not a game. So yeah, when you go around there, you'd be playing the games, and obviously they were very, very different. You know, the graphics, the sound, and, you know, quite often even the game itself was quite different. They'd have different levels, different layouts, different, you know, different enemies, or different, you know, there was a big difference in some games. Some they weren't. I mean, you don't get that now. You know, can you imagine if they launched a game now on Xbox and PlayStation, and one had more things in it, like had more enemies in it, had more levels in it? My lord, there'd be an absolute war, especially if it was a top game. But back then that was pretty normal, because the specs of each machine were radically different, and they had different strengths and different weaknesses. Whereas today, they're all pretty much based on the same architecture. What it tends to be the difference now is how much RAM or how fast certain processes are done. In other words, it's sort of different, different quality of, different specs of stuff inside, like your processor and what have you, but it all does the same thing the same way. And it's very hard these days to tell the difference. If you look at a screen of a game running on the Series X and a game running on a PS5, you would be very hard pushed to tell the difference. When you look at it with regards to the C64 and the Spectrum, it was very easy to tell the difference for the most part. There were some games that were ports, and unless you actually saw the game running and heard the game, you wouldn't know. They did borrow assets, particularly with some of the budget games as well. Sometimes if you knew where to look, you could see it. Quite often it might be if the game had any kind of border information. What I mean by that is live, score, all that kind of stuff. You could often tell which was the C64 and which was the Spectrum. The C64 tended to have more colours and no clashing of colours, where the Spectrum would, in a lot of cases, not in all, in a lot of cases. But even so, it was very notable, the difference. If you, like I say, you fast forward to today, it's very hard. So anyway, I mean, when I'd go round there, or they'd come round to, to my house at the time, we would play on each other's computers. That's what I'll call it, other people's computers. That'll be an interesting title. Not clickbaity though, because quite clearly I'm talking about my computer. But I'm talking about playing on other people's computers when you're around at their house. Now, one of my best friends at the time, he lived quite a way away from me. This is when I was going to secondary school, going to grammar school. And I used to stay over. Sometimes I'd stay over at his, sometimes he'd stay over at mine. And he had the ZX Spectrum Plus 2. And we'd play games on there, and I had a lot of fun playing on it. I kind of just like tech. I like computers. And I enjoyed playing on it. Found it very, very entertaining. Found it a lot of fun. And as I say, there were some games I played on there that were better than the C64. The first time I played RoboCop, he got it when it come out, and then I bought the Commodore 64 version while I was staying at his house, and then I had to wait to get home. And when I played it on the Spectrum, I thought, this is really good. And then I remember just being a bit disappointed with the C64 one when I got home. And that was before I come across the glitches. And as I said in my previous video, a lot of it centred around the fact that there was less speech in the C64 version, which was that was anathema. You never did that. C64's sample quality for its day was awesome. But yeah, I had a huge amount of fun playing on that. And one of my friends down the road, he had the, that I lived on, had the Spectrum 48, and he had like the little cartridge that you needed to plug a joystick in if you wanted to play games on the 48K Spectrum. You needed an interface, and I think there was the Sinclair interface, and then I remember there was a Kempston one, because on the menu when you would select the controls, you had like keyboard, Sinclair interface and Kempston interface. But anyway, you had this cartridge that plugged into the back of the computer that had your standard port connector on the back, and it was kind of funny. There's a scene in a television show called Micro Men. I highly recommend you watch it. It's a sort of semi-fictionalized thing, semi-fictionalized history of the UK computer scene back in the 80s. There's a scene in that where Sir Clive Sinclair, played brilliantly by Alexander Armstrong, details how to fix this problem, because it happened to my friend. You'd be playing the game, and of course the joysticks back then were wired, and you would move the joystick sometimes and it would slightly move the little cartridge connector port because it wasn't very secure, and it would basically cause the computer to crash because the connector wasn't brilliant. So what would happen was the connection would break, like temporarily, and that would cause the computer to crash, which isn't healthy for the computer, nor is it healthy for the input device and the cartridge, and it's not healthy for you when you've got really far into a game. And there were very few game saves back then. you get quite far into it and all of a sudden the bloody thing had reset and you're like, right, that's it. And in the show he details a fix which actually did work, because my friend did it while I was there. Not because he saw the show, because that show came out many years later, but it was actually announced at the time. And he rolled up, he snatched a little bit of blue tack off the poster he had on the wall, and he stuck that between the cartridge port and the cartridge, reconnected the cartridge, pressed it into place, and it worked. Absolutely worked flawlessly, because then that cartridge was not moving at all. And that was it. No product recall, no major drama, no class action lawsuits that I could remember. No. Simple DIY fix, and off you go. Next. Next issue. So, but yeah, I think we were playing Jailbreak at the time, and it wasn't me, thankfully, because he'd have probably blamed me for breaking his computer, but it, didn't break it. Yeah, fun times. Fun times. But yeah, I did. That's what I played on quite a lot, because none of my friends had a C64. all my friends say they were Spectrum owners. One actually had an Amstrad CPC 464. That was interesting. Yeah, at the monitor. That was an interesting system. I think I only ever played on it once though. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun playing on them systems. And then they'd come round to mine, they'd play on mine. It was very good. Now we had playground wars, as we called it. My computer's better than yours. That was sort of raged on in the 8-bit era, chiefly between C64 and Spectrum owners. It's amusing when you look back, really, because they both had strengths and weaknesses. I mean, you could argue on paper the C64 was the most powerful, but that didn't always translate to games. There was a lot of lazy ports to the C64 because the Spectrum, especially here in the UK for the most part, was the lead format, because in the UK it had the larger installed user base. But that's not to say that was the case with all games, just some. And it could be a little bit annoying. Could be a little irritating, especially with games like Chase HQ, for example. You know, where clearly they just did a very hastily put together port of the Spectrum version, whacked a C64 sprite set in there for the cars and the player cars and the border of the screen, and yeah, it played like shit. And I've already mentioned RoboCop, and that's not including the fact that the C64 version was glitchy and broken. Now, towards the end of the C64's lifespan, the developers did start to plug the holes in the limitations that the machine had, and it used to lose out to the Spectrum when it comes to resolution. The C64 had a higher res. Sorry, Spectrum had a higher res than the C64, but later on in its life cycle, game devs actually discovered a way of unlocking the ability to have a high-res overlays on the C64 graphics, and that was kind of transformative. Interestingly enough, that is in RoboCop. The game looks gorgeous on the C64. It's just broken. And that was a game changer. You did see some C64 games that looked truly astounding. The earlier ones tended to look a little bit blocky. But the later ones definitely started to look better with that the high res overlay. You saw some games that come out that were just truly stunning. The Untouchables is a stunning looking game on the C64. There are many others. I'm not going to list them. That's not the purpose of this video. But they were absolutely amazing looking, because it was an amazing machine. And I think, I've got it in my head, and if anybody out there knows whether this was true or not, but there was a game that come out on the Commodore 64, possibly around 1990, 1989, 1990. And I think it was called Phobia. It was a shoot 'em up, a scrolling shoot 'em up. Remember, there was a bit in here that had giant spiders. I think it was called Phobia. I'm not sure. So if I've got it wrong, don't hate on me. It's just not remembering it properly. But whether this is true or not, I don't know. However, there was supposed to have been at the time, the developers of that game found an exploit. Now, it could have happened in another game before then, but this is the one that stuck out in my mind. And this exploit, and again, factually, I could be quite wrong here, but from what I know, what I remember, it doubled the number of on-screen colours that was capable on the C64. Now, back then that was a massive deal. On-screen colours were one of the selling points of a computer, believe it or not. That's never mentioned today. But back then it was really important because obviously the more colours you can have on screen at the same time, the better looking a game should look, in theory. So when you're putting together your pixels to make the characters in the game, you would be limited by how many colours you could use at any given time on screen. If you doubled that, then that means you can make more colourful and more detailed graphics. So that was a really big deal back then. And yeah, I could be completely mistaken, but I just remember they made a big deal about this. And it was it was using software to exploit what was said at the time was a glitch in the hardware, in the, I guess it would be the video chip. And it got discovered that if you did weaved whatever magic, if you did that, you could actually fool a computer into displaying more colours. Now, I say that needs fact checking, but it's just something that I remember from the time, because I remember for C64 owners it was quite a big deal. There were some of them out there, crazy people, that were going, oh, the C64 now can do games that look like the Amiga. No, it couldn't. No. I mean, there's still a lot of limiting factors that would have prevented that, and if that was the case, the C64 would certainly have cost a hell of a lot more than it did. So, but yeah, just got that in my mind. But the game developers back then, they were great at finding ways of improving the technology. I'm not going to walk past that truck again, go back this way. Inside of the computers, they were geniuses at it. They were always able to push the boundaries. If you look at games on the Commodore 64 when it first came out, and compare that to how the games looked later on in its life cycle, my God, it was night and day. Even from a sound perspective, some of the music that came out of the C64 in its lifespan was just defied belief. It really did. And it was the same with the Spectrum. People got better They pushed the boundaries of what the tech was capable of. And it was remarkable what they achieved. When you think and look back, you think about just how good this technology was, how marvelous they made these games and how they ran, with, you know, some of them very complex, with kilobytes of RAM, not megabytes, not gigabytes, kilobytes of RAM. And it was the same on the Spectrum. There were so many amazing games. I mean, today you can get a next generation Sinclair ZX Spectrum via Kickstarter. It's called the Spectrum Next. I don't have it, you know, but it's a whole new Spectrum that's apparently backwardly compatible with the original from back in the day. How cool is that? Now, I know I put a video up about what's the point in this new Commodore 64 that they're coming out with, because it's basically a C64, but not a C64. The ZX Spectrum Next is a whole new computer, and that's just coming out on a Kickstarter. It's a, you know, there'll be games that come out on the Next that you probably won't be able to play on a Spectrum. It's not a retro computer, and it's not marketing itself as that. It's marketing itself as what would have been the next logical step for the Spectrum had Sinclair not been sold to Amstrad and then subsequently destroyed by Amstrad, and you know, the stuff mothballed, because that's what pretty much happened. Amstrad bought Sinclair. They got the rights to make the Spectrum. They made the ZX Spectrum Plus 2 and Plus 3, which were basically the case and shell of the Amstrad CPC 464 and was it the CPC 128? I think was that the one that had the floppy drive, 3.5-inch floppy drive. Yeah, they basically and just changed the colour to Spectrum colours and released it, and it was I'm not being funny, it was a disaster for Sinclair. It was a disaster for the Spectrum. You know, everything where that system could have gone and should have gone, it didn't. It just disappeared, and that was a tragedy. I don't own the Spectrum, but by God, I respected the hell out of it, what it stood for, what it achieved. You know, what Sir Clive Sinclair achieved, God rest his soul. The man was an absolute genius, and it's no exaggeration to say that without him and without the ZX Spectrum, we may not have had an entire generation of game developers and programmers that come out of the UK. The game scene in the UK wouldn't have been what it was. You know, it was affordable. The 48K Spectrum, the rubber key wonder as it's rightfully called. And again, this comes from a guy who was a C64 fanboy and owner. It was a remarkable machine that was affordable. It was a computer for the masses in a time where computers were very expensive. And a lot of people couldn't afford it. And it was, you know, for all of what people might, you know, say about it hardware-wise, it was a real achievement. Everything that was done to make it affordable, but also to make it usable. It was designed to get a generation of kids, my generation, into computers. You know, Sir Clive was worried that kids in the UK were going to get left behind. As I've already said to you, once a month I had access to a computer at school, and that was very briefly. You'd get 10 minutes, 15 minutes on it, once a month because the school had one BBC Micro. Even when I was doing computer studies from the age of 16 to 18, what you would call in the US high school, over here there were secondary schools, which were split essentially into comprehensive and grammar schools. I had 2 classes a week. And that computer was shared. It was shared between 2 people. At that point, myself and my fellow classmates knew more about the computer and more about tech than the guy teaching the class. I mean, I don't know if I've shared this story, but me and my friend got thrown out. We were sat just behind the teacher while he was teaching class, and he was going on about stuff we'd learned years ago. I'm not kidding you, I knew this stuff when I had my VIC-20. We were just sat there playing cards. It was boring. And we learnt nothing that we didn't know already. It was pointless. I could have just gone in and sat that exam without taking a single lesson in that 2 years and still passed. It's ludicrous. I mean, it's funny really. They modernised that school a few years ago, and they have a proper, what they call a computer sciences laboratory now. It's a computer studies room, and it literally was a tiny room that was probably had about 12 BBC Micros, and there was 20 odd kids having to share. I mean, what you're learning anyway when you sat there sharing a bloody keyboard with somebody, you know, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, I've got this, I've got that. I learned nothing. I just learned everything at home. I did everything at home. We had to build this database. I did a database of Cold War military aircraft at the time. And I ended up doing it on my C64 at home, and basically, like, you know, built the framework there. And then I took that framework, that idea, I had to write everything down and then bring it in and then try and cram it, doing it on the BBC computer in the class in the sort of brief time that I was able to do it. It sucked. If I didn't have a computer at home, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And that actually did contribute towards my score, my exam results. So, you know, it sucked big time. But that's what we were up against. That's what we were up against. And without people like Sir Clive Sinclair, who got computers into the home, because let's also look at the wider implication, competition. Commodore 64, if I remember correctly, was £399 when it launched in the UK. I think that's how much it was. When I got it in 1985, it was £299, and it came as part of a bundle. Now, the Spectrum at that time, I think, and I could be wrong here, I think was £200. I think the 48K Spectrum was £200, so it was a considerable amount cheaper. And again, I might be wrong, it might have been £250, I'm not sure, but it was cheaper. That's what was the important thing. And that made Commodore lower its prices. It had to. The Spectrum was outselling the C64. Now, again, that was chiefly in the UK. In the United States, it was a different story. Commodore's main rival in the US was Atari. And Commodore in Europe pretty much ruled the roost. But that was because Spectrum was building up. if Sir Clive Sinclair had been able to keep hold of that company, and if he'd have been able to get that computer out there to more people and build up the financial strength of his business, it's no exaggeration to think that he may have been able to overhaul Commodore both in Europe and the US at some point. You can't know it for sure, but there's a good possibility that would have been the case. But he sold the company to Amstrad. I think the big problem was the Spectrum QL, which was the sort of high-end Spectrum. I believe it was a 16-bit computer. It was supposed to be more business orientated, but I think they were having trouble with software, the software side of it, and I think that was what did them in. I think if they'd have just come out and with a straightforward 16-bit Spectrum computer to replace the 8-bit, and they'd have done the same principle, you know, okay, you want it so kids can learn how to program and use serious apps, but also for it to be a games machine too. That seemed to be a bit anathema for Sir Clive Sinclair. But at the end of the day, that's what kids wanted to do. And it was still a gateway. I did learn how to program in BASIC because I had the computer. Yes, I played games, but I also coded a text adventure game in BASIC. It wasn't commercially available, it was just for me, but, you know, the point is that it was a gateway to other things. I think if Sir Clive Sinclair had done that and just gone forward with a competitor, cheaper alternative to the Amiga and ST, I think he would have cleaned up. But he wanted more. Yeah, a lot of respect for that man, for what he did. There's a good chance, in a roundabout kind of way, that I may never have had a C64 if it wasn't for Sir Clive Sinclair, because the prices would have been unaffordable. But yeah, without the Spectrum, that competition, as we all know how things work, the prices would have remained quite high. And that would have been really difficult then for me to be able to buy it or to get one. So yeah, other people's computers. 8-bit edition. Which will probably be the only edition, to be honest, because with regards to the Atari ST, I only ever played on one once. And that was a guy that I had GEOS on my C64, and this guy was a computer whiz, and I buggered it up. I buggered up GEOS on the C64. What I did was I should have done copies of the floppy disks, and I didn't, and it basically filled up the floppy disk and made it unusable. Didn't know what the hell I was doing back then. And yeah, he fixed it. He was a bit of a whiz. He was the guy I was saying in my previous videos, worked in insurance, was a genius with computers, and when asked, why aren't you doing a job in computers? He said, why would I do that? He was the one that basically set me thinking about changing the course of what I wanted to do in life, because I was all about learning to program on computers and make games, or if I couldn't do that, getting into game journalism. And I probably would have hated games the way that things have gone. So, but I both thank him and also want to brain him at the same time, because I ended up doing something I hated anyway in finance. So, but yeah, very interesting though. And yeah, he fixed it. And while he was fixing it, while I was there, I was playing Star Glider on his ST. And that was literally the only time I ever played on an Atari ST. I just remember it having sampled music and sort of like sampled speech. There was a song at the beginning. And it looked very impressive because the game was running rather smoothly. You know, vector graphics based games on the C64 chugged quite a bit. But this was running a hell of a lot better, and I was impressed. And I want an ST, but I didn't get one because they were too expensive. And of course, years later, then I got an Amiga. So that was the only time I ever played on an ST, but I do still respect it as a good games machine. May not be as good as the Amiga. Any ST fans out there? I didn't make it, I didn't build it. Yeah, the Amiga for me was just a natural progression from the Commodore 64. It was its big brother. It was the pathway that you went, and that's what I did. But yeah, I've often wondered about the Spectrum. If I'd have been a Spectrum owner, maybe things would have ended up quite a bit different. Maybe I would have ended up a games developer. Who knows? Or working in the industry. Because I wouldn't have had GEOS, which came with the floppy disk drive on the Commodore 64. Then I wouldn't have gone round to get the disk fixed at the computer expert's place. Wouldn't have had that conversation, and probably would have pushed forward into going into that career. Isn't it funny? There's an alternate universe somewhere where I got a 48K Spectrum and ended up being in charge of Electronic Arts. No, I'm just kidding. That wouldn't have happened. I'd have probably ended up in jail for hitting somebody with a keyboard over the head by now, but the way that game devs are treated. But who knows? Who knows? I might have, just by staying around long enough, may have achieved a senior place in a company. And it's funny, a friend of mine from school who did have a Spectrum, and then he bought the Sam Coupe. He actually ended up being quite senior at Microsoft in Seattle. He worked in the game development studios side of it. Then he was working on the Kinect side of it. Don't know if he still does that now. But I had many conversations with him at school. He was a year younger than me, and he was a big advocate of the Sam Coupe. And he would speak. His knowledge was incredible, even at the age of like 15, 16. His knowledge base was remarkable, scarily good. He was programming games at that age, and they were bloody good. You know, he was great. Don't know what he's doing these days. I don't know if he's still at Microsoft. It'd be interesting to find out. But yeah, he got quite a ways up there, I think, in that company. I hope he wasn't part of the cull. I hope he moved on from Kinect and the Xbox division into something else. But yeah. Anyway, that'll do. Other people's computers. My God, I rambled today. I made up for the Sunday stroll being quite short yesterday, didn't I? Anyway, I'll call it there because it is starting to get a bit wet again. I need to go and buy some food. And yeah, that'll do. So, hopefully I'll see you tomorrow, weather permitting. and God knows what we'll chat about then, because I've kind of gone through quite a bit today. So yeah, I'll catch you later.